Going live.
Okay, good evening, everybody. My name is Brandon Burton, and I'm a director for Conservatives for Tradition in an Integral Nation. And I am joined by one of our regulars, which is, of course, Mr. Siri Kalsa, who is also a director. I will be chairing and hosting, if you will, this roundtable. This is number three. And happy Labor Day, by the way, to all of
Happy
our.
Labor Day to you. It's been a relaxing one, but a lot of interesting things have happened in August, and I'm excited to talk about it.
A lot of interesting things have happened over the course of the last 2 weeks since we last did a roundtable. We've got a lot of topics to get to. We're going to try to keep it under an hour. So let's get right into it. If you're ready, Siri. Of
Yeah.
course, what's the probably the big thing domestically that happened over the course of the last 2 weeks was, of course, the Republican presidential debate. Of course,
Yeah.
Donald Trump was not in attendance. We'll get to that later. The first question I just kind of want to throw up for conversation is, in your opinion, Siri, who was out of the folks who actually attended, who was the main winner of the Republican debate and why?
Well, I think before we can declare winners and losers, we have to really just candidly admit that there is a huge fissure in the Republican Party. There are the kind of, for lack of a better term, Trumpists or America Firsters. And with the absence of the 600-pound gorilla in the room, they were led by Vivek Ramaswamy, who picked up a lot of Trumpy talking points and a lot of that kind of MAGA rhetoric. He was definitely the standard bearer at this debate. Now, on the other side, I would say most articulate of the old 2004 Bush neocon Republican Party, low taxes, aggressive foreign policy, all that kind of stuff. It has to be Nikki Haley. I think she put it very clearly, and she wasn't afraid to own all the very severe policy differences she had with Trump and Vivek. Um, Now, we may not like that kind of politics, but there's got to be some demand for it because she wasn't afraid to say it. Now, her, Chris Christie, Mike Pence, they're all on the kind of pro-war, pro-business, old Republican Party side of things. And in my opinion, I think this debate wasn't really a political debate in the way we normally think of it because it's August of the year before an election year. The voters aren't really paying attention yet. This was an audition for donors. That's what it was. Um, and the donors like a lot of that stuff, frankly. The neocon stuff is always popular with the donors. They love low taxes. They love less regulation. They're very excited about a hawkish foreign policy. Now, your average Republican voter, your median Republican voter, an older, more working class person, is probably not that excited about, let's say, toppling some coup government in West Africa, but the donors are, right? The donors have those economic interests. And if they're going to put some money on somebody, they really want to see that their money's going to be worth something. So I think there are really two auditions going on. There's the audition for who can be Trump without, who can be the standard bearer of Trump without Trump himself, right? Who can be Trumpism without Trump? And then there's who's going to be the heir to George W. Bush on the other hand. It's like two completely separate debates, right? These people have very little in common except that they're all running as Republicans, basically.
Yeah, I mean the dynamic I think that really really jumped out to me was the fact, yes, I mean obviously you have these two tiers. Obviously we were absent Trump. And so everybody else on the stage, with the exception of Ramaswamy, pretty much were vying for the donors who would give the money to fight Trump.
Yeah.
Because Trump is going to, in my opinion, he is going to carry the populist, sort of your average Republican voter. He's clinched that. So this is, I think it's an elite effort to keep that neocon voice in the Republican Party and just keep that going? And who is going to be that voice going forward to to keep it alive and to attack Trump? That's what it seems like to me.
So you think basically that it's they know that Mike Pence or Nikki Haley or Chris Christie aren't going to win the primaries, but they need them there to attack Trump, to weaken Trump for the general election.
In a word, I think it is an effort to keep the neocon vision, worldview alive and well in the Republican Party. It's to lend it credence and lend it support.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit on that side of the old neocon George Bush Republican Party. I think there's a dance going on right now. The donors know that if they want to have any chance at all of knocking Trump out in the primary, which there isn't much chance of, but if there is a chance, they're going to need to throw all their money and support behind one person. Um, I think it'll probably end up being Nikki Haley. It may be Mike Pence, but this is an audition for them. Like I said, the voters aren't paying attention yet. This is more like a kind of battle royale to see who that person can be. And I think Vivek is being the Trumpy voice here. He's basically defending Donald Trump when Trump himself is absent. And if I were Trump, I wouldn't have shown up either. He's so far ahead in all the opinion polling, he doesn't have to do anything. He's going to sweep the primaries if he doesn't end up in prison. And
Well,
maybe if he does end up in prison, he might sweep the primaries as well.
we're getting ahead of ourselves just a little bit. So, in my opinion, because this is the dynamic on the stage for the Republican Party debate, I feel like, and having watched the dynamic between Trump and Vivek, from Trump to Vivek and Vivek towards Trump, I really feel like Vivek is really, he was auditioning for vice president. That's my
Yeah.
opinion. And I've only, that's my conviction. It's only gotten stronger post the Republican Party debate.
Yeah. I think Trump always retaliates when he's attacked. And if Vivek stays not attacking Trump and saying Trump was a great president and I'll pardon Trump and Trump is great, he might be vice president. If he's not, he'd definitely get a cabinet appointment. I think he knows that. He's a relatively young man. He's 38.
He's sharp as
Um,
a tack, and he
he's
is
a sharp,
well spoken.
yeah, a sharp guy. But I think him becoming, anything, chief of staff, secretary of the interior, whatever, would be a huge step up on his political career. And vice president would be incredible. And I think Vivek knows if he can angle for vice president, Trump will be 78 by the time he takes office. And he's not a young man. It's possible Vivek could become president, or even if Trump finishes his term, Vivek would be a shoe-in to run in 2028.
Yeah. Um, on foreign policy, I think as an organization, we're very lockstep almost with Vivek.
Yeah.
We disagree with some of his more libertarian sort of stances when it comes to just obliterating some of these federal agencies. Me personally, I'd much rather, we've spoken about this, I would much rather see them reshuffled, reformed. But I personally would not want to see the baby thrown out with bathwater. But this really leads us into the next question. We've already touched on it, but I want to get your full thoughts on it. Was Donald Trump the big winner for not attending the debate?
Yeah, I think so. Because if Trump had shown up, every single candidate minus Vivek would have attacked him on that stage. There was literally no upside. Um, he's got name recognition. Everybody in America knows who he is. They either love him or they hate him. The Republican base loves him. There's no benefit to him debating. All it was going to do is expose him to attacks and sound bites that could be used against him. And I think he made the right call ultimately by not showing up. Now, if these forces coalesce behind one candidate and there's a debate in February or March and it's starting to get competitive, I think he will have to show up at that point.
Yeah.
But right now, while they're all polling at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%, what's the point? And well, if you're going to go into the biggest loser, I have some thoughts on that. But Trump was the big winner because the more he's attacked by the mainstream media and the more he's legally attacked, um, you know, the Republican base has kind of become contrarians as to kind of the mainstream discourse. The more they attack him, the more they like Trump, and they feel like they just want to stick it to the man by backing the guy that they're told is the absolute worst ever. So
Can
yeah,
you the other dynamic I think to this is, can you imagine if Donald Trump had been up on that stage, as you put it, with at least seven other candidates who would have just been whacking him on top of the head, which, quite frankly, at this stage in the game, for a former president of the United States, that's not only would it seem little league for him,
yeah,
but can you imagine the vitriol
yeah,
that would have occurred on that stage, not only just with Chris Christie, okay,
yeah,
with Chris Christie alone, it would have been a nightmare. But you would have also taken it to a new level had you put the man up there on the stage with his former vice president,
yeah.
whom he does not see eye to eye with, and whom the average Republican voter, I can only imagine, despises generally at this point. He can get up on stage and he can bring up Jesus all he wants to. Jesus is not going to help him with the average Republican voter.
I remember driving through rural Texas in December of 2020, and people had scratched out the Pence name underneath their Trump Pence signs. That's how irritated they were with him. So yeah, I think Pence has no chance. The kind of politics he's about, that was 20 years ago, you know. Um, that was George W. Bush stuff. I mean, right?
Yeah. And we've
And
talked about this too, the way that basically all of these other, we'll call them leading voices, they are up there on the stage, we'll call them leading voices within the Republican Party, how they seem to be stuck back in the 2004 Bush Kerry election.
yep.
They have not progressed a decade past that.
No,
It,
no.
it's the
And
opposite of a breath of fresh air.
yeah, and I mean, you have to think they're very comfortable in that space, right? Because they get everything they want out of it. They get, tax cuts, and they also get the aggressive foreign policy, and they also get the subsidies like Medicare Part D that George W. Bush did. It's a comfortable space for them, and they're really not comfortable that the base has moved past it, but it has. I think the Trump election really showed that people knew that their Republican candidates were not serving their interests. And they were voting for them just because they couldn't imagine voting for the other guy. But given an alternative, they'll take it. And they did. And on that note, I would like to talk about who I thought was the biggest loser of the
Oh
debate,
yeah, go ahead. Go
which
ahead.
is Governor Ron DeSantis, who came out with so many canned lines. It was like him and his aides basically went out to a cabin in the woods and just fed him zingers for a week.
Yeah.
And he just came in there and just said, I'm going to try and get my sound bites out. Look, I think politics is a lot like public speaking. You can memorize a speech, right? Anybody can memorize a speech. You can deliver it by looking down at notes, or you can just recite it, but it doesn't come off as real and authentic unless you actually have some talent for public speaking. Politics is the same way. I don't think Ron DeSantis has that natural charisma.
It,
Trump,
if I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. If I could just
yeah,
sneak
yeah,
this
yeah.
in real
Go
quick.
ahead.
I think if you'll recall, back when it was rumored, not official, but rumored, that Ron DeSantis, I live in Florida.
Yeah.
So I've seen the internal state level politics under Ron DeSantis.
Hmm.
And I don't mean to take away from the fact that he won an incredible election in Florida, in the state of Florida,
In a
but that
tough
has
year, too.
not
Yeah.
translated to the national level. I was shocked the day after the debate, how many people I saw on X, formerly Twitter, who were absolutely adamant that Ron DeSantis was the biggest winner on that stage.
Yeah.
And I was, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I felt like I was being so gaslighted, you know. I was
Yeah.
like, did we watch the same debate? He comes off as very, as you said, rehearsed, unrelatable,
Yeah.
and quite frankly, strange.
Well, he's the kind of guy where everything looks great on paper. He's young, he's a veteran, he's been a successful governor. He's implemented all the wish list policies that the base wants in the state of Florida and won in a very tough year, 2018, and in another tough year, won a landslide. So you would think this guy on paper hits every box, but he just doesn't have that X factor. He doesn't have that personal charisma. And maybe it's just TV. He's not good on TV. Maybe he's better. Retail politics, shaking hands, whatever. But I just don't feel it. And Trump has that X factor. Love him or hate him. The guy's a natural and he comes off on TV. He has the timing of a stand-up comic. Perfect timing.
Yeah. No, I don't. You can have all the money in the world, and if
Yeah.
you aren't naturally gifted as someone who can connect with the average voter,
Yeah.
you're not going to win an election.
No. Bill
Donald
Clinton
Trump
had
did.
that. Bill Clinton
Bill
had that
Clinton definitely had that.
in 92. He started out way behind the incumbent president, but he had that X factor. He really did.
I know
And
that it was a different era, but Bill Clinton won not a few southern states.
yeah, he did. And, you know, that was a pretty incredible achievement at the time. But that just goes to show you. I mean, politics, we can talk about wish lists and policies, but some of it's just a feeling. Some of it's, you know, um,
It's
irrational.
God given. It's God given.
It's God given. Yeah. Some
Um,
people are meant to do
yeah,
it.
that's right. I want to continue moving here because we are trying to keep it under an hour. We've got a lot to get to. But
Sure.
before we leave this general topic of the Republican debate, I want to talk about we we, we touched on the dynamic that you've got basically Trump and you've got Ramaswamy. They seem to be very what's the word? I mean, they seem to be very together. The they're of the same ilk, we'll
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
Everybody else seems to be arrayed against that worldview and
Right.
against that view for the country.
Right.
Um, so it begs the question: what if Donald Trump does, well, assuming that he wins the Republican primary, and he probably will. It would take something absolutely monumental, in my opinion, to take that from him. But let's say that he gets to the general, and then he loses again. There's really no chance at his age that he's going to run again.
Right.
I think that Vivek is too young to carry the Republican mantle on his shoulders on his own. I don't think that he has the type of charisma where the average Republican voter will coalesce around him the way that Trump was able to pull off. Now, you've got a dynamic in the Republican Party where the loyalty to Donald Trump is on a level I've never seen before in American politics, either in my lifetime or from any of my studies going back to the modern era. I mean, let's just
Yeah.
say Theodore Roosevelt. I've not seen anything like it. So should he lose, what does the future of the Republican Party look like after Trump, should he lose to Joe Biden again? Where does it go?
Well, I think it may, in fact, discredit the populist wing. Um, it may discredit the populist wing, and people will write 2016 off like a fluke. And I think if Trump goes away after that, basically Trump was the only guy that had his own money in 2016, didn't need donors, and could take these positions that the base liked, but the money class really didn't like. And Ramaswamy doesn't have enough of his own money to do that, and neither does anybody else on that stage, frankly. So if Trump goes away, I think without winning, right, without without a victory to make the populist side more powerful, then you may just be back to Republican Party politics as usual, which basically means they're going to lose every election, barring some extraordinary scandals. We're back to the permanent Democratic future. I
Yeah,
think the populist wing is the only part of the Republican Party that can recruit new voters into the coalition.
well, I have friends who are adamantly, for whatever reason, they're adamantly still behind Governor DeSantis,
Hmm.
and their reasoning for that is at least hitherto, they see DeSantis as the savior. This is their words. They see DeSantis as the savior of the conservative movement. And I tell them time and time again, the conservative movement should not be our main concern. To me, it is much, and I think it's probably the view of this organization, that it's much more important that the right wing populist movement succeeds rather than the so called conservative movement.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, all right, I think we've beat that dead horse enough. I want to move on to something that's very timely. Um, Sometimes we get to things a week or two after the fact. This is very, very timely. Um, and that is the war in Ukraine, right? That's the gift that keeps on giving, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Right. But this is very timely. So the 3 month long, much ballyhooed Ukrainian counteroffensive, it seems to be grinding finally to an end. I mean, after about 3 months, it's grinding to an end,
Yeah.
um, with very little to show for it, except about 43,000 dead Ukrainian troops. What happens now as we move into the fall?
Well, I think you've seen mainstream papers start to change the narrative. I've read articles in the New York Times and the Washington Post quoting administration officials who didn't want to be named, but they were giving their quotes to the papers, that we can't move a mountain of steel like we did over the past 18 months again, because we just don't have the stuff. So, when you have the mainstream news starting to change the narrative, saying, well, they've advanced 5 miles, 10 miles, whatever it is, in 90 days, and a lot of the gear we gave them is wrecked. A lot of their assault troops are dead or wounded or have to be rotated out from exhaustion, and we can't move a whole nother mountain of steel. What they're basically saying is, at worst, we're just going to be abandoning new offensives because, as we've all read about, the Russians built a defense in depth, multiple defense lines, pre sighted artillery, a lot of mines, a lot of landmines. And trying to attack that without air superiority is not something the US Army can do. Okay. I mean, it's you have to give the
Never would
Ukrainians,
do it. We
no,
never would
never
do it
will.
if we couldn't establish air superiority.
No, you got to give the Ukrainians the benefit because they're brave to do that. They certainly don't lack courage. But doing that with the Russian supply lines behind the Russian troops and them able to move reinforcements around and counterattack locally with attack helicopters, there was just no way they were going to punch out to the sea unless there was a very serious error made by the Russians. Now, the Russians have made plenty of errors in this war too. But what that means basically is the narrative change means we're not supporting any new offensives, which means the fantasy about retaking Crimea is gone. And I think the administration is going to start nudging and then nudging a little harder and then pushing the Ukrainians to try to make peace before the election year. I don't think they want to go into an election with the Russians making serious gains and embarrassing them. It would look terrible.
Yeah, and there has been two, you brought up Crimea. There has been at least two attempts by Ukrainian commandos in small boats, three or four boats, to land their forces on the shores of Crimea. They successfully did it once. I think they
Yeah.
threw up a flag, hopped back in their boat,
Yeah. Yeah.
laughed and said, "Oh, we threw up a flag," and then headed back over to Odessa or
Right.
Snake Island. They're coming from Snake Island.
Okay.
But they just recently did this a second time, and Russian aircraft blew them out of the water.
Yeah.
They did this about a week and a half ago. So it's as if to say we're not giving up on Crimea, but in order to retake Crimea, you would have to have a large amphibious assault, which obviously in modern warfare you can't assemble over in Odessa, and cross that strait and land a massive D-Day force on Crimea. I mean, so much of this in modern warfare to me makes no sense.
Yeah.
I don't know why they keep this up. As far as going into the fall, their counteroffensive is over.
Yes.
It seems like in Zaporizhia, they have attempted to grab a foothold, and it seems like a placeholder. We're going to hold this, and then we're going to wait until next year, as though Ukraine might even be a country this time next year, and then we're going to push a little bit more and a little bit more, and they're looking to mobilize another 200,000 or 300,000 people. They recently removed a lot of the rules and regulations about your health before you can join the Ukrainian military. So now, if you had illnesses that prevented you from being drafted, well, now those don't matter. So they're really starting. You got to think that Ukraine has built and rebuilt approximately 3 or 4 different armies at this point, and they're attempting to build another fourth or fifth one.
Well,
Why? Why? It's ridiculous when you think of, because Russia has way more people. If they mobilize, Russia is going to mobilize.
yeah, a couple points on that. I mean, in 1940, 41, 42, the British were doing commando raids into France and Norway and blowing up, little tactical targets, submarines, airfields. It didn't change anything about the war, but it was just kind of done as a morale thing. Now, you can insert commandos, but that in no way changes the strategic picture, right?
No.
They knew they couldn't knock the Germans out of France until America built up a big enough force. The Ukrainians are doing the same thing. They send commando units in, they blow something up, they skedaddle. It doesn't really affect the war. The war is being decided by industrial production, training, equipping, logistics, just like all major wars are. So they're doing this, I think, for the benefit of their own morale because they haven't gotten really where they wanted to be in their offensive. I think their hope, if I were in their shoes, their hope would be, well, the US will give us all these Abram tanks and then we can try again the next year. But the problem is Russia's also mobilized its own defense plant, which is very large and extensive, and they can produce a hell of a lot of gear. I think whether the Russians themselves will counterattack, I don't know. I don't know if they want to risk the high casualties that would come for like a big World War II armored offensive.
Well, that's the big question because they've built up these fantastic defense lines,
Right,
which the Ukrainians seem happy to impel themselves upon.
right.
So once you move your troops forward of those defensive lines that you built, now your own defensive lines are behind you. You've got to keep going.
Yeah,
So I think I think, and I think Vladimir Putin said the same thing. At a certain point, they will counterattack and they will move forward. They will only do that though when they know that Ukraine is weak enough that they'll crumble.
Yeah.
And I think that that will be the decisive part of the war in the east. And I think they'll roll it up east of the Dnieper, and whenever they invade the Kharkov region again, when they do that, that's going to be the prelude to it, I think. Whenever that happens, you can probably safely say to yourself, they feel confident
Yes.
that they can push them west of the Dnieper.
Well,
Now, yeah, go ahead.
two points on that. I mean, you hear a lot of like tired old World War II propaganda recycled, like, oh, the Russians don't care about losses, they're brutal, and all this kind of stuff. But if you know a little bit about Russian history, the war in Afghanistan, the first Chechen war, these conflicts were ended because of protest movements by soldiers' mothers. I think the Russian political establishment is very sensitive to losses, and they don't want to do a big, massive World War II style offensive and the casualties that would come with it until they're 100% sure it will end the war. And I think that's why they're sitting on the defense.
Well, and I think they're doubly sensitive about it in this conflict because they are not going to take the chance that if they do a massive offensive and they do crumble all standing Ukrainian defense, they're going to take high casualties, like you pointed out.
Yeah.
They really don't want to take high casualties because then, if the Poles were to move in, plant a false flag, then they have to fight all of NATO with a much weakened man force.
Yeah.
That's why they're very sensitive about the people that they lose.
Yes. And I
Now we
think
know that,
one thing that they're doing better before we move on is training all those mobilized soldiers. Some of them have trained for 6 months. The training on the Ukrainian side is short and is getting worse. So even though they can mobilize quite a lot of men, what is their combat effectiveness? Um, the Russians can rotate troops in and out of the line. We haven't seen that for Ukraine.
yeah. So moving on, we know that it's the end of the counteroffensive. I think one thing that was very telling in the news just uh, yesterday, I think. So the Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov, he has been replaced as the defense minister. So I think it's obvious that this is an attempt to bring someone else in who obviously will not have to be, will they won't have to shoulder the responsibility for the failure of the counteroffensive. They can basically say this was a failure of personnel. We've got this new person. This is a quick fix. Um, so this, I think, along with almost everything else that the Ukrainian regime does at this stage of the game in this war, it seems to all be optics and politics and nothing really substantive. My question to you, I'd like your opinion on, okay, so you get away with it this time. You get away with a media redirect by striking the Crimean Bridge. You get away with these media redirects by, landing some commandos over on Crimea to plant a flag, and then you head back to Odessa. At what point, though, how long can the Zelensky regime specifically shield itself from the blame? Because I think that's what this is. How long can the regime survive before the blame is turned on Zelensky himself? How do you see this unfolding over the next few months?
Well, I think before we can answer that question, the Ukrainian media has all been essentially nationalized and forced to stay on the same page by law. There's a state of emergency. There is no more free press. And rights of free speech and protest are severely limited right now. So as long as people are willing to believe the propaganda, he can insulate himself from the failure of the counteroffensive. That may change if enough people die that everybody knows somebody who's dead. And at that point, it becomes impossible to hide. But for now, there won't be any. All opposition parties in Ukraine have been banned. There's no political opposition or independent media. So you can kind of just tell the people there whatever you want. And unless they have a direct, concrete reason to disbelieve you, I think you can just go on, passing the buck, as it were.
So I think that this question, let me sort of turn this question a different way. I think that this is more to the point. Do you believe that President Zelensky is gripped by forces at this point that he cannot control? In other words, is he compelled to continue the fight because of his Western puppet masters and because of the nationalist right that exists within the military and the government for fear of his life? Or do you think it's well known that Ukraine cannot defeat Russia militarily? And I think the leaked documents suggest this certainly. And that Ukraine's role in the war is only the planned prelude to something larger to come.
I am hopeful that it's not, but I think as to the primary question, is Zelensky compelled to do this? I think so. Yes, there's the threat from the nationalists. I feel like that was stronger before the war. Um, them trying to remove him now that the US is involved, I don't think it would fly. But we have the leaked draft treaty from March of 2022. And if Ukraine can't push the Russians back and ends up with a peace that's worse than the one that was proposed 18 months ago, then all of those tens and hundreds of thousands of dead are basically on his shoulders. That will doom him. I mean, forget about winning re-election. He'll probably be charged with crimes. Um, he has to find some success somewhere or he's done for. And I
I
think
agree.
when
At,
that's the bottom line.
at this point, too, you have to think, and there are already voices within Ukraine. I forget who it was somebody within the government who talking about, or they're answering a question that was essentially um, criticism about how slow the counteroffensive was. And this official, I forget his name, he said, "You are essentially spitting in the face of every dead Ukrainian soldier just to ask that question."
Right.
Now, I disagree with that. That's to say that nothing can be questioned, the official narrative can't be questioned. I do get that it's war, and they are fighting for the national sovereignty, essentially. However, I also feel like when you say something like that, you're admitting something deeper, a deeper sentiment that has to be affecting Zelensky, which is once you have, let's just say the figures I've heard are true, roughly 400,000 dead troops. At this point, how do you just pull back and say, you know what? I think the smart thing, actually, after all of this to do, is to negotiate with Russia, and they can have all of these areas in the east that voted to become Russia. But at the same time, what you stand to do if you don't reflect on that and you don't change course is you don't have only, and I don't mean to say that only 400,000 is a small number. It's not. It's way larger than it ever should have been. But you stand to lose 6, 7, 800,000 troops. And at the end of the day, it's just going to be the same end result.
Hmm.
So at this point, I agree. I think that Zelensky is in an almost impossible situation. I'd like to say I feel sorry for him, but in my opinion, he brought a lot of this on himself. He
Yeah, if he
really
had
should have
sued for
stood up
if
for.
he
He really should have stood up for the interests of his own country. In my opinion, I don't think that he's done that.
Well, let's put it like this. If he had sued for peace in March of 22, he may have himself lost his life, but he would have saved a lot of others.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay, so I want to move on to the situation in West Africa. This is news that's been popping off. So recently, there, of course, has been two military coups in West Africa. The first of which was in Niger, and then the other one is in Gabon.
Right.
Both of which seem to have significant popular support. Do you think that the timing of these coups are merely a coincidence? And do you think that this is the end of French neocolonialism in West Africa?
No, I don't think it's a coincidence because you saw an attempted coup in Sudan as well, shortly after the US upped the aid ante in the Ukraine war. Before his death, Evgeny Prigozhin was spotted in Sudan, spotted in Libya, spotted in Mali, spotted in Niger. I think a lot of this is indirect Russian payback for some of the stuff we've been doing. I think they're giving support to these regimes to throw the French out. And whether that's a good or a bad thing for the country, I couldn't say. I don't know enough about these places to know how good or bad the existing governments were before they were couped. Now, generally, military coups are a sign that the institutions are very weak or something is very, very wrong in the country, such that the military has to get involved. But without the support of the Chinese and the Russians, I don't think there's any way they would do it because, for example, Niger does not have a military that could stand up to a French expeditionary force or US air power, God forbid. So they have to be counting their support somewhere, where I think even there they wouldn't be dumb enough to do that because France has intervened in Mali before, and they could do so again in Niger or Gabon. Um,
I
and
think that the
unless
optics, I think that the optics for the French would be so incredibly terrible, which I think is why they really would prefer to see this military intervention if it happens, and we're going to get to that in a second. But if it did happen, that it comes through and by Nigeria and preferably other ECOWAS nations. But that leads me to the next question. So, with the coup in Gabon, which the timing of that is also incredibly suspect, do you feel that the coup in Gabon increases the likelihood of military intervention by Nigeria in Niger, decreases the likelihood, or has no effect?
I think it's decreasing the likelihood because if you have Mali and Niger and Gabon, and who knows who's next, all kind of moving into the Chinese slash Russian sphere of influence, the Nigerian army is not a crack army, okay? They would have trouble subduing Niger, as it were, and a large part of their population is from the same ethnic group in northern Nigeria, who would be very upset with an intervention. Could they win a guerrilla war? Not long term, even if they could take the capital. I think Nigeria knows better. And I think they're probably telling us that, hey, there's no way we're going to do this unless you commit some Western troops alongside of us and give us air cover. And
Well,
I don't know that France is willing to do that, or they are right now. And I know the United States isn't willing to commit ground troops.
yeah. From the figures that I've seen, Nigeria actually has a very sizable force for
Yes.
the region.
Yes.
But more importantly, just compared with the size of military forces that Niger commands. However, I think this is why you've seen the banding together with Niger of countries like Burkina Faso and
Yeah.
some others in the region. It's simply an attempt to put some counterweight to the size of force that ECOWAS could put together through
Mm.
Nigeria. And
Yeah.
it's to say, you better think about this. You really need to think about this before you act. So
Yes.
I agree with you. Long story short, I think that it decreases the chance. They claim that they have a date for D-Day. I
Oh,
think, and they said that before the coup in Gabon. So I think that the timing is suspect. And
well, bringing this back to our politics, I was told there was a massive drone base in Niger, U.S. Air Force drone base. Why is it there? What are they doing? Why have we never heard of this? These are the questions. Now, clearly, the U.S. isn't happy. They sent Victoria Nuland to Niger to try to talk them down. It didn't work. So, if that's not working and there's implicit threats, I think they're counting on support from somewhere, probably from the Wagner Group. And if Wagner's involved, local Nigerian forces are probably not going to be able to crack that nut,
yeah,
which leaves Western forces.
I think it's very odd also that all of this occurs right around the BRICS Summit 2023, when BRICS is really getting really getting going and starting to make its presence felt in the world, starting to grow. And where is one of their key concerns? It's Africa.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
and that of course segues into the nice thing. I want to touch on the BRICS Summit. So we have a member. His name is Corey Faust, and we were hoping that he could join us on this roundtable. He was not able to. Hopefully, what I can do is I can bring him in and interview him one on one. He's someone who has direct experience in West Africa, so his insight would be great for the coup situations in Niger and Gabon. But also, he was one of our first members back before the war in Ukraine ever broke out. He was one of the first members in our organization to say that the future would be focused on BRICS. I think that his prophecy is by and large coming true. Um, but I want to pose these questions to you as well, even though I may get Corey in at another time and get his take. Um, I guess the first question is going to be, um, well, let me just ask you, Siri, do you feel the same way since this has played out since the beginning of the war in Ukraine? Do you feel like BRICS is still the future? Do you feel like geopolitics is going to be powered and revolve around BRICS to a large extent? Do you think that this is the new, uh, sort of the new order coming about, or do you think this is going to compete with the old order?
Well, I think BRICS has grown proportionally. Now, remember, this is not a military alliance. This is just an economic agreement that they're entered into. I think BRICS has grown in proportion to U.S. sanctions aggression. I think confiscating Venezuela's gold, for example, was a very scary moment for a lot of the rest of the world. The unilateral sanctions against Russia, which provides a huge amount of petroleum to the rest of the world, I think woke a lot of them up. And with Russia accepting rubles for its oil, conducting bilateral trade with India with rupees, with China for yuan, I think they're starting to demonstrate that you don't always have to clear transactions in dollars. It's possible. With Saudi Arabia starting to allow some transactions in non dollar currencies, I think where this is really going is they want to build an economic model that is not going to be vulnerable to sudden sanctions collapsing markets. And I don't blame them for that. Now, really, ultimately, their holy grail would be an alternative reserve currency to settle transactions. They're still a long way away from that. Could it be done? Maybe eventually it could be done. But we have nobody to blame but ourselves. The sanctions on Iran, Trump did that after kind of making up with them. It kind of shows that the US isn't willing to be the banker to the world like we once were. If you're going to be the reserve currency, you've got to act like a neutral bank, right? If you want to run Swift, you can't just use Swift as a political tool. And since that's been done, I think everybody realizes like, hey, If I have massive dollar reserves somewhere and the US doesn't like some policy I'm doing, they can just freeze all my money and lock me out of the markets. That's an
Mhm.
existential threat. And I think BRICS is a slow beginning where all these other countries and what used to be called the non aligned world are starting to try to immunize themselves against that threat.
Do you believe that BRICS is revolutionary in character in its challenge to the United States as the world hegemon, or do you believe that it is reform minded in character?
It is a reforming organization because what they're trying to do is just do the same thing the WTO did decades ago, which is try to make rules of the road for trade between these countries. Nobody's committing to overthrow the US, nobody's committing to anything military. What they're trying to do is just make a reliable trade system, which is what we once did. And the countries they're inviting into BRICS after the Johannesburg summit are countries like Iran, um, countries that have been locked out of the global financial system in many ways by the US and that control vital choke points in the world economy. Egypt, the Suez Canal, Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia. What they're trying to do is make it possible to trade despite whatever the US happens to be on about at the moment. So in that way, I see it as reform, right? We laid the groundwork for global trade after World War II. That was the United States. What they're really trying to do is just continue that without us if we've grown too unreliable to be that hegemon anymore.
Yeah.
Now, if they are able in 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years time to float a reserve currency that proves stable, that would be pretty revolutionary. But there's a lot of challenges with that.
So if you want my take, I think that that question is a trick question. The reason why I say that, I think the answer is hybrid, because if you read the statement that came out of BRICS 2023, they bring up the World Trade Organization. They bring up the United Nations. It doesn't seem that they want to create a system outside of these entities. It doesn't seem like they want to destroy these entities. It seems like they want these entities to serve their intended functions, at least on paper, and perhaps they never truly have. Or maybe they did at some point in their early existence, and we have since taken it over, and now they work to serve our purposes. So, let's just take the two that they specifically mention in their statement from BRICS Summit 2023. They mention the WTO, they mention the UN. They want them to serve their purposes that they have on paper. So if the thesis is that these organizations only serve the West's purposes and that
Right.
they're basically an arm of our hegemony,
Right.
it is revolutionary. It's reform in the sense that they want to reform these institutions ostensibly to make it work in a more democratic way for the entire world. And
Right.
ideally, who could argue with that, right? But it is revolutionary if you suppose that they do serve the West's interests mainly, specifically ours. Because if you do that, then you're basically competing for control of these world institutions. And that in its own way is revolutionary.
Right. Well, two very large economies, China and India, and a very large producer of petroleum and all these other vital minerals the world needs are now in this. And so just having an alternative there is itself pretty dangerous to the system we've set up. Um, but I still think if they do roll out that reserve currency, you'll really see the fun and games begin.
Yeah. So, in your opinion, is BRICS the engine of the rise of multipolarity, or is it simply a byproduct of the rise of multipolarity?
I think it's a byproduct because as China has risen to become the largest economy by purchasing power parity in 2017, and India is also growing at a pretty substantial rate, and Russia kind of got back on its feet and is a major exporter. All three of these countries are very leery of being involved in a system that can be shut off by the US basically at will. And so as they grew, it was inevitable that something would have to change. And if they can't influence the existing institutions the way they like, they'll either create bilateral ones or multilateral ones. BRICS is the multilateral one. And the fact that they have so many applicants shows that there's a lot of countries out there that are just interested in trade, but without the political vulnerabilities that go with basically buying into the whole US world financial system.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a tool, at least for multipolarity, because if you listen to what Vladimir Putin has said, he said that the multipolar world is inevitable, that it is here, and our actions in Ukraine and across the world militarily is simply sort of like the death throes of a dying empire. So with BRICS, I mean, essentially, I mean, you're right. I agree with everything that you just said. It's it's a way to free the developing economies throughout the world so that they can keep more of what they own, so that they can pull themselves up through fairer trade. And if that happens, then of course you will get a multipolar world because it will be regional, you know.
Right.
So yeah,
Well,
I
if
mean,
those countries hadn't grown to the point they are now, it wouldn't matter if they created BRICS because their economies would be so small, nobody would care.
yeah.
Um, so
But
I
really,
think it's definitely a byproduct.
yeah, it may have been a bit of an unfair question because it's there's definitely interplay both ways.
Right.
One complements the other. So the last question I want to get to, and we're sticking with BRICS, but with BRICS competing for business in the world, with the developed collective West, what would be America's best course of action at this point to secure its own interests and the peace and prosperity of our own people?
Well, that's a huge question. You see what they're doing now. They're basically trying to cannibalize Europe of its industry and move it over here by creating very high energy prices and gas prices. So in that way, they're trying to reshore right now. Now that would be a long process, and they're not doing enough. They're doing it with microchip fabrication too, um, in Arizona, maybe counting on Taiwan not being there after a while. But I think if they really wanted to guarantee our economic prosperity, they could really turbocharge the reshoring by applying some tariffs. Now, right now, the massive deficits we run and the amount of bonds we have to float, it's maybe not possible to wind that down quickly. So who knows what the future will hold? But I think to really, really generate long-term prosperity in the U.S., you're going to have to start applying some protective measures and reeling back the financial control. You just have to.
Yeah. No, I think in my opinion, maybe on like an 80,000 foot view, foot view, I think for America, we're at a crossroads where I think instead of spending billions and billions of dollars fighting this world trend, frankly, I think that we should embrace it. Unfortunately, before that happens, we know that there's going to be internal political strife and conflict because the entrenched financial interests obviously do not want to see an end to the current world order that was set up after Bretton Woods,
Right,
World War
right,
II.
right.
But now, what's best for them is not necessarily best for the average American person.
That's right. That's
I
right.
think that we should embrace multipolarity. We should start pulling back some of these forward forces that we have across the globe, which costs enormous sums of money year
Right.
over year to maintain. And once we do that, we can start focusing internally because all of the boogeymans across the world, they serve as a purpose. They serve as something existential, an existential threat to keep us together, or maybe not really together, but sort of hostages of
Yes.
the political financial elite. Now, once those existential threats cease to exist, well, then they know that they're stuck inside America with us, and we're going to start looking around
Yeah.
and we're going to start the purge. And I don't mean that literally or violently, but I mean that we're going to have to examine ourselves once those existential boogeymen are gone. That's when true reform, I think, for the better and true healing can occur within our own political system. And then we can rebuild from there.
Right. And I think there will be ways that we stay involved internationally, even if we completely changed the direction of our foreign policy. American agriculture, for example, tremendously productive. We could feed the entire world if we wanted to. There's a lot of things we still do really well, and we could guarantee food security, for example. But yeah, I mean, just making America basically a center for financial speculation while all the productive stuff goes elsewhere, you can't do it long term because something is going to change.
All right. Well, Siri, I very much appreciate you hopping on this Labor Day. That concludes that wraps up all the questions that I had. So, for our viewers, I very much appreciate you joining us on this Labor Day. Remember to check out our website at integralnation.us. You can check out our Twitter handle and feed. And please join us next time. I think we'll be doing another roundtable in maybe another couple of weeks. But thanks again, Siri. Thank you for our listeners and viewers. Have a
And
great one.
follow us on Substack at integralnation.substack.com. That's where we publish our new content in written form.
All right, Siri. Well, thank you very much and have a great one.
You too.